Hey everybody, BeardoDood here with a new series looking at the different skill trees in Stoneshard, starting with the weapons trees, the one-handed weapons. With me today is DarLeeLlama.
Guest commentator DarLeeLlama here.
So we're going to start off by talking about swords and then we'll move through the others, just talking about our experience with it and which skills we like the best.
Swords are typically the standard weapon that most people think about when you think of an adventurer in any kind of fantasy setting. Swords being a very versatile weapon. Historically, they can be considered sidearms in certain respects because others cultures would rely on longer range weapons, but you almost can't go wrong when you talk about having a sword as a weapon to do um, pretty much anything. They cut, they stab, they slash, they slice and dice in several different ways. And what kind of fantasy game would not have the sword? The sword starts off with two skills at the very beginning: cleaving strike and blade maintenance. Cleaving strike and swords in general work off strength and agility. So if you pump up your strength and agility, the skills will get better the more you pump up those particular stats. Cleaving strike is going to be your standard attack ability for the sword, and then the blade maintenance is its passive, and they work very well together. Um, Cleaving has a range of 1 and can hit 3 adjacent tiles. It deals a little bit of bonus damage at 26% for me on this character at any rate. And it has a bleed chance. The thing about Stoneshard is that swords are the bleeding weapon because they cut. I know in other games, like I've played World of Warcraft, for example, um, daggers tend to have the bleed. But to me, I really like to see that in Stoneshard, the fact that swords are the primary source of bleeding when it comes to weapons. So cleaving strike has a percent chance to bleed, and most abilities from swords will have bleed chance. Um, it also gains 10% counter chance for 4 turns with each enemy hit. This makes it a great standard skill because it strikes wide, it deals bonus damage, and it can debuff your target. Very good ability. I'd basically rate it a 4 out of 5 as a general purpose use. What do you think, Beardo?
Well, I haven't gotten into the swords too much, but that one definitely does look pretty useful. I think one of the things that I notice when I look at it, the tree in general is interesting, is you can get all the way to the end in 3 skills compared to some of the other trees. You need at least 4 or 5.
That's definitely a very valid point because I think a lot of swords branch off for particular abilities or passives that work well with their primary ability. Um, for example, if we go down to keeping distance, this works really well when used with cleaving strike. Because if you cleave strike, you can hit multiple enemies, and then keeping distance allows you to back up if you're basically overwhelmed. Let's say you don't want to fight 3 people at once or 2 people at once. You can move backwards and attack. And since we're talking about it, I'll go ahead and segue into this ability as well. This has a range of 1, so it's meant for close range. A moderate energy count at 13, a nice cooldown at 9. It requires one-handed swords to be equipped, which, by the way, the weapon trees are very good as well for using with a alone, because it just requires the one-handed sword. Dual wielding, because you can have a sword in each hand and still use the ability, or with a shield by going sword and board. So that is a particular thing I think that should be of note when you do weapon trees. Keeping distance retreats a tile back, and in the next turn, if the empty tile is occupied by an enemy, you perform an attack with 36% damage and plus 56% bleed chance for me on this character. So that's even more improved than the cleaving strike at 26 versus and 41. It is better at 36 and 56. So It's a matter of battlefield advantage. If you know where you're going to be, if you know where you're going to lure your enemies and how you can control them, that ability is very good because you can attack them as they come around. Now, I will say that this particular skill has a flaw, and that is it retreats first and then it attacks if they go to your empty tile. I've had plenty of instances where I've played a character that used keeping distance only to have my opponent buff themselves with a stance. So it ended up being completely backfired, and the only use of the energy at that point was to basically walk back a tile. And I had no harm in doing so because they weren't going to attack anyway. So I would rate this like also around 3 out of 4, 3 to 4 out of 5. It's very useful when it's useful, but if it's not, it's not. Going over to these passives, these are very good abilities for swords. Blade maintenance. Sword durability reduces 50% lower or slower. If the equipped sword's durability is 75% or more, it gets 10% weapon damage. 10% weapon damage may not seem like a lot, but it counts for so much when you compare to the amount of actual weapon percent damage you're getting from strength. And a lot of people like to dump points into strength for the purpose of getting better damage. Getting a whole 10% off only the fact that you're keeping your weapon in good shape is amazingly good for 1 point investment. And the fact that it deteriorates slower means you're saving on your repair bill for the weapons. What's really good about it is that it also gives 2 passive bonuses, cooldown duration and fumble chance. Fumble chance is basically a direct effect of accuracy as well, because even though you can hit with accuracy, as long as you're not fumbling, you're going to be doing good damage. You want to do both. You want to have good accuracy, you want to have good fumble chance. So having a passive bonus of a -3 fumble makes this a very good talent, and I also rate it very highly. 4 out of 5. Honed Edge is another passive. Each sword strike gives you 5% bleed chance for 4 turns, and it will stack. Now, here's the thing. I'm not positive how high this can stack. Theoretically, it should only stack to about 20%, because it only lasts for 4 turns. But if you have other things potentially capable of extending a duration of any kind of passive or bleed effect, it could go potentially higher. You'll be talking about Daggers later, and I know that people have talked about Daggers having a similar ability of a unending stacking passive. How would this work, for example, if we were to use 2 swords? Would you then have the potential for 40% bleed? So this could get crazy really fast. Considering that these swords work off of bleed chance as one of their primary benefits for using swords, and it has a passive bonus of 5% bleed chance to boot, this passive makes it one of the best for swords, and I would rate it even higher than the other skills that we've talked about so far.
I think actually with I had been reading on the Discord because somebody had asked about that, especially with using dual wielding now. I don't think that they stack off of the offhand. I think it only stacks off the main hand.
Well, I know that when you do 2 weapons, right, it reduces the percent chance overall for you to do a particular debuff. My example for this is I was playing with Peasant Flail, right? And those give +2 days, +2 stun. When you have only 1 in hand, it's +2/+2. When you have 2 in hand, it's +3/+3. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So each hit must be capable of you doing a stun or a daze, because they're both getting a chance to attack, and there's an inherent reduction to those percentages to balance that out. When I put 2 stun weapons on it, I think +4, I think I'm getting +5.
Mm-hmm.
I seem to remember when I put on militia flails, Militia flails are +4 stun. When I put 2 of them on, my total in my character sheet is only a +5. So if you think about it from a dual wielding perspective, if this is giving a +5 bleed chance, I'd say your ultimate bleed chance is somewhere around +7 total. But it's for each weapon. With each weapon having a +7 chance to bleed, it could ramp pretty quickly. As long as you remember that you're not getting a whole +5 every time you get this bonus because you are dual wielding. So I'm not positive, but it has the potential. I would need more testing.
Yeah, I think what maybe I was misunderstanding it. I think what they were asking about was the stacks themselves, because they were alluding to if you have two swords and you attack with each, then does that create two stacks? And I think the developers were saying that it only would create one stack. So I think everything as far as the percentage and everything is still carried over. But yeah, we probably have to do more testing just to make sure.
If that were the case, then the best that this could give you for the talent alone would be a total of +25% bleed, because you're getting 20% for the 4 turns stacking, and then 5 from the passive.
Mm-hmm.
And then that would get cut by, I want to say around 40-60%. I'm not unsure. Maybe just a straight half if you're dual wielding, which would make this less useful. But again, if it only gives you one stack, what would be the point of dual wielding unless you could achieve multiple hits or bleed chances? You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm unsure. I think it would need better testing for us to make a better determination. But as it is, the fact that this talent alone gives more bleed to a weapon that purposely tries to bleed people as much as possible, that's pretty good. Now, this is also relative because, like I said, I rate this pretty highly, but as long as you're not fighting undead. In fact, most of the sword skills are going to be really good against anything that bleeds and really bad against anything that won't bleed. When we start seeing later enemies that might be like elemental, potentially, right? Or more undead, or anything that just won't bleed, swords are not going to shine. That's a given. Going on the onrush in my opinion is the absolute best gap closer skill out of any other weapon, with maybe the exception of heroic charge. The reason heroic charge might outdo it is because it gets so much bigger damage bonuses depending on how far you can go. Now my range right now is 5, but I think I've got talents and whatnot that increase it. Standardly onrush has 4. And with this ability, you very easily are able to hunt things down and rush them down quickly. And that makes it an immensely good skill overall. You dash in, you deal damage, and then you just start going to town. The fact that you get a very large damage bonus, almost 50% for me right now. Now, admittedly, my stats are a little off. They're modifying my actual percentages, but you still get a very good damage bonus for that initial strike. Means that if they're weak enough, you can outright kill them. So we're talking like rabbits, boars, foxes, etc. Very good to hunt down food. But it also has armor penetration, which gives something that swords has really lacks, right? Well, up to now, we've only been bleeding, but this actually lets you penetrate. And that will help for certain enemies, like armored enemies. When you start running into high-level humans, or even armored skeletons and things like that. Being able to get through some of that armor, at least a little bit, helps immensely in the long run. The fact that it also gives bleed a negative to bleed resist and bonus damage taken, which, by the way, bonus damage taken is much better, in my opinion, than bonus weapon damage, because it's any damage they're taking, not any damage you're outputting. Damage that you output is dependent on what weapons you have, what other bonuses you have. Damage they take is any damage that you've basically ramped up and then give to them. I feel that damage taken for them is better. So that makes this an even better skill.
Are there any? Does this one have any passives that stack on with it?
It comes with -5 cooldown duration for this ability tree, and
Well,
that's what most of the starting weapons that were introduced have. -5
so
cooldown for the ability tree.
I guess I meant more like on the skill wise because I know that heroic rush does, or is it heroic charge? It does have an additional passive skill that can make it even stronger. So I was just curious if onrush had some like I think it's next to it.
I'm looking at heroic charge right now. It has other passives that increase it.
Yeah.
So if we only consider onrush as a individual skill, that is why it shines in a lot of ways compared to heroic charge, because it benefits everything that it wants to do. It increases your chance to bleed. It penetrates armor, which you don't normally do. It gives them a debuff of +10 damage, right? Plus, it has the best range, natural range out of all of the gap closers. When I go over the Greatsword, we have rushes towards target, delivers strike. Each travel tile deals +12% damage and 5% crit chance. That crit chance is what makes heroic charge so great. Not necessarily the damage. I mean, because it has a range of 4, right? So that means at max 4 tiles, 4 times 12 puts you at 48. Onrush is, for me right now, 46%. It's basically the same. Now, if you are capable of extending that, for example, using the talent Courage for Greatsword, which increases its ability range tile by 1, that's when it outdoes the damage on Onrush. It also gives the ability to refresh, which is what makes why I said heroic charge probably outdoes it, because of that massive crit chance and that the fact that it can refresh. You're basically wandering around lopping heads off. You won't do that with Onrush, but Onrush has a naturally higher range, and it complements its tree, which is why I rank it so highly. We also have Gloat as a passive. Sword attacks have +5 crit, +5 weapon damage for each bleeding effect on the target. Now, I will say one thing that kind of seems to hold people back when it comes to swords, and that is how great is bleeding really if the enemy doesn't have enough HP to survive multiple attacks to bleed out? Does that make sense?
Yeah, then most people would probably only look at something like the troll or the end bosses maybe even as where this would shine compared to fighting a normal bandit or, some kind of animal, deer or rabbit or whatever you may find out in the wild.
Absolutely agree. The swords are not going to truly shine when you're fighting something that's easy enough for you to kill. Swords are going to truly shine when you fight something that is hard for you to kill. In particular, the human bandits that have like heavy armor at the end of the later levels, the later level spread of the game. When they start to get so high enough level that every one of them is wearing like plate mail and stuff like that, being able to bleed them down will be a lot more effective because they have chances to get bleeding. The fact that every bleeding that you put on them is increasing your crit chance has the potential to spiral out of control. You're basically dealing more and more damage to them the more you hit them and the more that they're getting that debuff. The fact that you kill a bleeding enemy, resetting your cooldown by 50% is basically just cherries on top. And then I'm a fan of any passive bonus that gives straight up stats, particularly crit is good. And this gives +3 crit. So this is actually a very good passive too. Basically, most of the sword tree all around is going to have great skills and abilities and passives. Going on to endurance training, sword attacks have 25% chance to restore 5% of your max energy. Compared to other energy restoring stats and skills, I found this one to be a little lackluster until I considered abilities that hit multiple times, right? If you use this with dual wielding in particular, and use it with what's that called? Flurry of blows. You have 4 chances that each have a 25% chance to restore 5% of your max energy. That might not seem like a lot, but if you have a lot of energy, 5% can be a ton. And if you run things that are necessary to have high amounts of energy, this would be a very necessary passive. That being said, as it is, it's kind of a bonus to help you keep your energy levels up. And I'm not going to ignore anything that does that. Keeping your energy up so that you can continue to use abilities, particularly when you're fighting multiple enemies, and a lot of them, not just one-on-ones, but a lot of them, this ability would be very good. And then finally, we have the Fencer's Stance. It's the stance-based skill for swords. Every weapon tree seems to have a stance skill. This one was used big time by a person on the Reddit who posted a 60% dodge before dodge became a thing. They used this stance to basically rack up a ton of stacks back when it was 6 stacks. Now we are up to 4 stacks only. That is the new stance cap. But we get 5% block chance, 5% counter chance, 5% damage, and 3.5 dodge. All of that is amazingly good stats to have in combat for a moderate price of 19 energy and a relatively low cooldown at 9. I feel like this is actually one of the better stances for defense and attacking, but particularly defense, because of the block and the dodge. Beyond that, it's got the same basic abilities of stat cap before and basic attacks prolonging it, so there's not much else to be said. But overall, Fencer Stance, pretty good.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add is there's no conditions that it's going to fade off, which is nice considering there are a number of the stances that do have some kind of condition that has to be in place.
I agree. Absolutely. So my verdict on swords overall is swords excels at what it does best, and that is bleeding big targets. If you're doing enough damage to kill normal targets, you don't even need to worry about them. But this particular tree is great for bleedable bosses, and that's what it's meant to do. I rate this tree very highly overall, and it pairs perfectly either with another sword or a shield. However, I would choose others if I were to go only one-handed. I feel like swords work best with shields. That is my personal opinion. But I could see it being dual wielding as well. I've heard dual wielding favors swords very highly.
Yeah, I started a character with a new run with Jorgrim doing dual wielding. I was thinking of doing swords. I'm still on the fence on which one I'm gonna pick, but yeah, no, I agree. And I think the interesting thing too and it's the case with some of the weapons, is that they really don't start to shine until you get to bigger and badder enemies. So we might see that swords become very, very good later in the game as more content's added, more enemies. Newer enemies have more HP and are harder to take down. Troll is one instance of that, but there could be normal enemies we fight in new dungeons that are like that as well.
Absolutely agree. And honestly, if it comes down to it, you can always just avoid undead dungeons. They don't roam. But everything on the above world, they're alive. So this will work against them.
That's a good point. Yeah, you're not going to be out in the forest and come across a skeleton, but you will come across bears.
So, now that we've given you a rundown on the swords tree and how well it works on its own, we are now going to switch over to daggers and compare it to daggers, because it is a very similar weapon to swords, somewhat doing the same thing. So, are very similar things. So, Beardo, what are your thoughts on daggers?
So far, I really enjoy daggers. I did dual wield daggers with Derwin, so we'll go through the different skills, and kind of like how you did. I'll rate them in their own way. I think the thing about daggers is it has a lot more fluff, and that there are a lot of skills that you can skip, and there's a lot of them that are completely essential to the build. So starting off, double lunge, doing 2 strike, 29% damage, 40% bleed chance. So somewhat similar to the starting skill for swords, and that you're looking to do bleed damage. And then also, if you do connect with both hits, then it reduces the cooldown, so then you can just kind of go right back to using it. Definitely a good skill to start the tree off with. Looking at the other ones, it breaks down into 3, so much different than how swords are. We could
Before you go on, I would just want to state right quick. I've had conversations with plenty of people on the Discord that getting double lunges cooldown to 1 is pretty much the dream. How do you feel about that?
Definitely. I mean, especially if you have the energy to do it, then you really don't need any other skill. It's and then and it kind of almost reminds me of Flurry of Blows. If you were able to get the cooldown to 1, then you're doing it in 2 turns, but the same idea. No, I agree. That would be pretty ideal to be able to get it down to cooldown of 1. So looking from left to right, from the shadows, this passive, your attacks against unaware enemies, plus 20% damage, plus 20% armor penetration. This one is cool, but stealth is not yet implemented in the game. That is a feature that they're looking at probably in Way Forward, maybe after. There hasn't been any confirmation that stealth is going to be in the next update. So this one is kind of a huge pass. And even with and you do get the cooldown duration is nice, but the plus 5 stealth isn't really going to do that much because we can't hide. Eventually, from reading Kickstarter, we're supposed to be able to turn off lanterns or the torches and do more sneaky stuff. But for right now, from the shadows, that's a big pass. I definitely did not get this one when I played.
I agree. It seems useless. I noticed it has a passive bonus of plus 5% stealth. Do you know if that does anything whatsoever?
I really couldn't tell. I saw when I was playing as Derwin, I definitely was going up in agility. That was my main focus. So my stealth was probably close to getting in the double digits, but I really didn't see any difference. I actually felt like I was sneakier with Velmir and able to get closer to enemies and do attacks from 2 tiles away than I ever was able to with Derwin. I almost always,
You weren't wearing it.
yeah, exactly. I was almost always using bow and arrow when I was running dungeons, just kind of keeping distance and starting off with that before going into full-on stab mode. So next one is Painful Stabs. This is the stance space skill, which is nice that you get it within 2 skill points. It gives a crit chance, crit efficiency, 25%, does body part damage and bleed chance. And let's see, using ability skill tree grants 1 effect. Oh yeah, so if you're using skills, it adds. And then also, if you're just doing basic dagger, yeah, the dagger attacks too will also prolong the duration of the effect. So usually when you do use painful stabs, it's good to just continue to stab without using any particular skill. But you can throw them in there, especially when we get down to the next set of skills. Probably has my favorite skill in there.
Now, I've seen people make the argument that stance-based skills are worthless. How do you feel about that?
I found that they actually have been really useful. Painful stabs being an example, and also with the spears with Velmir. That one is quite strange in that you have to stay in place, but usually when you're playing that way, you do. It's nice in that you get the bonuses without having to actually use the skills, so you can pop it off before the enemy even gets to you, and then you're in the case of painful stabs, you're able to stack it and prolong it as you're attacking enemies. So it really will keep on the whole time. And there's skills within combat mastery as well that will make these stances even stronger. So in my opinion, I always like to pop off the stances. Sometimes I forget, just in case I'm knocking down a bunch of weak enemies. But if somebody heavy's coming at me, I always make sure I've got a few tiles between us, and I'll pop off the stance for whichever weapon I'm using. What about you?
I agree. I feel like stances are there for more difficult enemies, particularly like end of dungeon bosses. I don't want to pop a Henbane every time I go into a dungeon, just so I can guarantee to have an advantage against that boss. I'm always looking for something I can put up, give myself that edge, and this stance seems to do that perfectly. Daggers seem to have low damage overall. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And they make up for that with the critical attacks.
Critical attacks and crit efficiency, that's the big part there. Because you want to be able to do higher damage with those crits. And if you're not getting that extra damage, it's bad, right? So having this as a boss killer is definitely useful. In fact, any stance should be used as a boss killer, in my opinion. But obviously you can use it when you're being like surrounded or whatnot. But I would not discount stances for that reason only. Oh, I'm not using it against, all these weak bandits. Of course you shouldn't be. You should be using it against the big stuff.
Well, and it is, at least this one, and I imagine many of the others, they do have high energy costs, and that's 24. So, yeah, I mean, if you're just fighting one-off enemies or one or two lowly enemies, there's no reason to pop them off. It's mostly when you see that you're going to be in a situation where, especially in the later dungeons, when people have or when the enemies have a lot of heavy armor on, or it just looks like you're going to get outnumbered, or if you're looking at your energy and maybe you only have 25 energy, it might be better to pop this off so that your next few hits are upped, as opposed to just popping off one skill, just doing one double lunge. So yeah, I always like that it's right after. So 2 skill points right off the bat, starting in the game, you can already have your stance.
Yeah, I think that's the earliest stance. I don't think I've seen any other that does that, right?
Not to my knowledge. We'd probably have to go through them all, but we'll save that for later.
I think I'm looking right now, and I don't see it.
Yeah. So the next one in here, this is definitely a fun one to have, Quick Hands. It's one of the more unique passives, so if you have your second loadout has Dagger, at least one Dagger, switching to it doesn't end your turn. So basically, the way that I was using this, especially in the dungeons, is I would have my bow and arrow, and you could literally wait until the enemy was right in front of you to switch, as opposed to nowadays, if you're using crossbow, you would have to make sure there's at least one tile between you, or even further if the enemy has rush. But the nice thing about having this is even if the enemy rushes you from like 2 or 3 tiles away, you can quickly switch to your daggers and start pummeling them. You're not going to get that. They're not going to get an extra hit on you as you're trying to switch back to your primary weapon.
So, I feel like this passive was meant to allow you or to promote ranged weaponry. If you don't use ranged weaponry, how would you value this?
Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't really make sense to have a sword build, sword and shield, and then switch to dagger. It really only makes sense with bows. And you could make the argument for crossbows as well, but I really think this pairs better with using bows than crossbows.
Well, it wouldn't only be bows and crossbows. You could do staves as well. Because, like, let's say you're running Jonah, and you go for a magic and dagger build. Dagger for close range. Pyromancy for range. I know some people do that. I've done that in the past.
No,
And it was
I
nice to be able to switch to it. You just switch to your daggers, and then you start stabbing them in the kidneys.
yeah, no, I that is a good point because when you have the stabs, the saves they give you the extra bonuses to your magic and stuff. So, no, it's definitely a valid point and probably one of the main reasons why Jonah has affinity with daggers to start off with.
Yeah, I just feel like if you're not using range whatsoever, if you walk around with daggers, skip this one.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
the icing on it, the icing is dagger kills decrease cooldowns by this ability tree for 1 turn, but that only happens on a kill. It's not like it's going to be in combat mastery. Combat mastery has stuff where every time you counterattack or critical, you get a reduction. This is only on dagger, specifically dagger kills. That's not a big enough icing to take this if you don't also use ranged. And I also don't think the passive bonus of +3 accuracy is enough to warrant a talent point spend.
Yeah, I agree. That is definitely the kind of build out that you would need to use this. And if you're not, then yeah, if you're just running another character and your you know your main weapon is going to be dagger, double dagger, dagger, and something else, whatever. I would skip this one as well. There are definitely more skills down the line that you can use the points for, or even jump into the utility trees as well with your extra skill points.
I agree.
So the next two, they're pretty fun. Gaping Wound delivers strike 20% armor penetration, 55% bleed chance, and 124% body part damage. And if they're injured or bleeding, you apply it for 8 turns, and it also increases the cost of their energy costs or abilities. So this one is definitely fun to use. I've used it a number of times when I was playing as Derwin. It was definitely one of the go-tos, especially since it's, other than the one next to it, it's really the second actual active that you'll get. The first 3 after the first one are all passives. So, well, I guess technically Painful Stabs is active, but actual skill where you can hit somebody with it.
I could see why you would say it's passive, though, because you want a pre-buff. You don't want to use it during combat.
Yeah.
Not unless you're desperate and you're in the middle of a troll fight, I should
Yeah,
say.
exactly. And that might be the one time. So this
The
one
body part damage on this is very nice. It's comparable to axes. And being able to basically decapitate, or not decapitate, but to incapacitate a body part is widely undervalued, I feel.
Yeah, I feel like every time I use this, I was definitely breaking someone's, bones, their legs or their skull or something. So, and then you get the additional bonuses on top of that if you do hurt them that way.
Yeah. Definitely for bosses, because when they use an ability, it makes them bleed. And they're going to use abilities because they have them. So it's very nice. It's a very nice ability. I think it's also interesting that it's the only ability in the Dagger tree that's modified by perception. Did you notice? Well, a second ability. The other is one of 2 abilities. The other being coup de grace.
Yeah, I guess I was just, well, the thing is, when I was playing as Derwin, I was doing range, I was already putting points in perception anyways, but I actually hadn't really noticed that until now that, it's also modified by perception, which is interesting.
That's exactly who I used it for. Derwin with range combat, daggers short range. I noticed it was modified by perception. I was like, oh, good. My agility perception isn't going to miss out on damage. But it kind of boned me for double lunge because my perception was not being added for double lunge. Now, that being said, double lunge is awesome on its own, but it could have been even better. It made me want to rely on Gaping Wound as a ranged Derwin more than double lunge.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would make sense. So the next one is definitely my hands down favorite, Deadly Trick. This has to be the most fun and yet the most annoying skill to be used against you. So you deliver a strike, 24% damage, 30% crit chance, which is nuts. It burns energy for the amount of damage dealt, which, well, I'll get into that after. So the fun part is that you swap places with the enemy, you apply confusion for 1 turn, but at the expense that the attacker gets a 25% crit chance for the next turn. But just from my experience, for whatever reason, when I would use this, it generally wouldn't do very much damage. But the bonus is that you're doing the confusion, and then as you're hitting them, I mean that just kind of makes it even worse. But yeah, I think it's the most fun, and definitely anytime I'm playing another character and I see the little dagger guy, the thief looking sneaky guy coming towards me, I know that he's going to use this. And most of the times that I've died, it is because this is used on me and there's 3 or 4 other guys coming at the same time. What's your experience with this one, DarLeeLlama?
Well, I have to admit that whenever I hit painful stabs, and I finally have an ability point that I can put in either Gaping Wound or Deadly Trick, that is when I have probably the biggest existential crisis of my life. Because I'm like, which do I get? They're both so good. And it usually goes to Gaping Wound.
Mm-hmm.
Primarily because I'm very impressed with the 56% bleed, well, for me, the high bleed chance and the high body part damage, right? I also like the fact that it makes abilities cost more and whatnot. For Deadly Trick, what I'm most impressed with is that plus 31% crit chance. Yes, you're only getting 1 strike, but it's a crit with plus 31%. Well, plus 31% to try the crit. If you're going a natural agility dump on your stats, whether you go agility perception or agility strength, you're also getting crit. So, you're almost guaranteed, not guaranteed, but you have a very, very high chance to crit. And if you have a weapon that makes use of that, all the better. They only recently announced what the changes were, or what the statistics were when you actually do a critical hit. I want to look that up right quick. what the dagger crit is. Because I think they get a massive crit bonus to damage.
While you're looking that up, I would say the one place in which this is not as fun or useful is when you're in the dungeons and you're in a tunnel. It's usually best to save this, because otherwise you're really, especially if there's 2 enemies, it is fun to knock the one out, and have him confused. But you swap places and you've got a guy right behind you, so the bonus of having the confusion, you're still going to get attacked. So in those instances, it's not always best, but sometimes it is really good for positioning in ambushes and things like that.
Well, I think the most interesting thing on that. Now, I don't remember actually swapping places with an enemy and thinking that that wholly benefited me, because I'm in a dungeon. It's like there's enemy and then enemy right behind him. So if I swap places, I'm kind of sandwiching myself. But it might be different for your experience. Now, I could see this being really good if you're trying to get your, let's say you put your back to the wall, and then the enemy comes up on you, and then you use this to switch, and now you've got Mighty Kick, and you Mighty Kick him in the balls straight into the wall. That I could be seeing really fun.
Yeah, that would be a good combo. Deadly Trick with Mighty Kick.
But I noticed that swap places with the enemy, applying confusion for 1 turn, the attacker gains plus 25% crit chance. Is that you or is that them?
I always assume that was them, but that always confused me as well, because if they're in confusion and then you give them that additional crit chance after that next turn, I would imagine that it disappears. And the thing I always notice too, and I don't know if this is just how they count turns in Stoneshard, it always seems to be 2 turns that they're confused. At least that's the way that I always see it. I don't know if maybe I know that in with Troll Slayer they did some they nerfed it a bit, and I think they might have even nerfed it in Bolt Thrower. I don't remember exactly, but I always seem to remember I would do the confusion, and it would be like I could get 2 attacks off before they would be back to normal. I don't know if that's because you hit a confused target, they remain confused, or something like that.
I think it must be you, because confusion specifically says they cannot attack or use abilities. So why would they get a crit chance?
Yeah, it is weird. I would almost need to watch them turn by turn to see how it works.
Well, I mean, like, if that is the case and it is your character that gets that plus 25% crit, because I haven't used this ability enough, I must admit that I would know off the top of my head. But you get 31%. Well, for me, it's high level percent of crit for your first strike plus damage that burns energy for it. And then you get crit on the next turn too. That's really freaking good.
Yeah, now that we're talking about it, I do think it does apply to you, because I have noticed getting a pretty good number of crits after using Deadly Trick. I don't know if that's. I don't know if that.
The more I'm reading, the more I like the skill.
Yeah, I may even go as far to say that this is my favorite skill in the game, other than maybe maybe Boulder Toss is also very fun to use.
I've never gotten far enough in the Geomancy to use Boulder Toss yet.
It is really fun if you get to it. Just hurling boulders at guys and watching them fly back and get dazed, or even
I
just
want to
ending
feel like
them.
an earthbender. Just start tossing boulders at everybody.
Exactly.
I like the skill.
Yeah, definitely.
I need to do daggers again. I need to go for Deadly Trick instead of Gaping Wound, because I always get the Gaping Wound.
Yeah. I'm almost thinking, because I'm planning on doing a Jonah run, I might have to do Pyro, Staves, and Daggers after this conversation. So make use of Quick Hands. I think that would be pretty sweet.
Yeah. You don't, when you do it, you don't actually use any points in staves. You just use the stave for like the magic power bonus.
That makes sense.
You use Pyromancy to actually just rain down destruction, and man, it gets to the point where you're almost a full Pyromancy build, but it's so nice in the early game to have double lunge.
Mm-hmm.
So, particularly when you've got Quick Hands, which lets you just immediately switch.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I imagine it's super useful if you're playing as Jonah.
2-point investment, just to make sure that you don't get totally boned when you're close range. So,
all right, so going through, because this is kind of the whole, this has got to be definitely my favorite and probably the coolest skill in the tree. We'll go through the other ones a little bit quicker. Weakening Jabs, it's a passive. Each attack with the dagger will grant +4 damage taken and +5 cooldown duration for 6 turns.
this is the skill that we were referring to in swords. How far does it stack?
Yeah, I think there probably need to be a good amount of testing. It is nice to get that +5 weapon damage as well, though.
Mm-hmm. So maximum, normally, with a single dagger, it'd be 24% damage bonus, damage taken, by the way, and 30% cooldown duration onto your enemy when you hit them.
Yeah, and that's really good. So it's kind of fun. Weakening jabs, painful stabs. They seem to go together.
I think that the fact that double lunge hits twice would apply this twice, correct? Because it's 2 attacks.
You would think so.
It should be, you start out assuming you double lunge to begin with. It'd be 8% more damage taken plus 10% CD for 6 turns. I honestly, the damage taken and the weapon damage passive is the part I like the best about this.
Yeah.
Just because, you know, daggers need bonus weapon damage.
Yeah, definitely.
They suffer otherwise.
Big time. So going next to that one, we've got Coup de Grace. This is the other one that uses is modified by perception. So it delivers a strike with +1 armor penetration, +4 damage, 4% damage for each remaining turn of bleeding affecting the enemy and each missing percent of the enemy's health. So that one, and also if the attack kills the enemy, it ends the turn. So this is actually really well paired with Gaping Wound, and that's kind of how I was using it. So you use Gaping Wound, and that would almost definitely cause bleeding most of the time. And if they have low health, then this is basically just a finisher move.
I am a huge fan of axes. And one of the things about axes is its final ability execution, and it pretty much performs the exact same way that this ability does. Except this ability also benefits for each remaining turn of bleeding. It makes me believe that bleeding is the important part here, but it's the each missing percent of an enemy's health. Now think about that. When you use this ability, you're going to want them to be around, what, 15, 20% health remaining?
Mm-hmm.
That means you flip it. Let's say 20%. That means 8 times 4, 320. You are getting a bonus of 320% damage for using this ability. So you just stab the hell out of them, kill them, but that's not even the best part. The best part is that it doesn't end the turn. So you turn right around and stab his friend in the throat too.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? It's really good as a finisher. It's basically what I would quantify as a finishing move. I've seen some skills that don't have exactly good finishers, but with execution and axes and coup de grace, they're pretty much a very similar. They perform the same function. This one does it slightly better because axes get +3%. This gets +4%.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes through armor. So I feel like this is maybe even better. The only problem is that it has, because knives have such a low base weapon damage, it needs it. It needs that extra percent.
Yeah, definitely.
But still, that passive of if this attack kills the target, it doesn't end the turn, is what really cinches this for me as being a super good ability. 5 out of 5.
Yeah, I would say this. I mean, really, all of the active attacking skills with the daggers are all great, and they definitely complement each other, especially Gaping Wound and Coup de Grace. I loved using this one as a finishing move. I definitely rate it pretty high. Probably second favorite to Deadly Trick, if I had to be honest.
Yeah, I could see why.
So the other two, I believe, are passives. We have Counterattack Mastery. So dagger attacks grant you +4 counter chance for 5 turns, and that stacks as well as getting +3 counter chance. I have seen discussion going back and forth on how great counters can be, just because, especially with something like daggers, I guess if you don't have high defense and you're doing a lot of counters and the enemy is getting those attacks back on you, because you'll see like a chain where you counter, then they counter, then you counter. I've seen those chain up, and that's actually how my Derwin run on permadeath ended. I was fighting the Necromancer and his little skeleton boss bro that he has with him, and it was basically just counterattack back and forth, and I was whiffing my attacks, and yeah, and on top of him being, you know, undead skeleton, not doing very well with any kind of bleed. Yeah, what are your thoughts on countering?
I love seeing counterattack chains, but I've been where you were, where a counterattack chain ends up poorly for you, and then suddenly it's not your favorite thing anymore. I do like counterattacks. I just don't like it when I have high fumble and low accuracy.
Yeah, exactly.
If that is the case, particularly the fumble, I think the fumble is the thing that screws me more than anything. If I can have very low fumble, give me all the counterattacks possible. You know.
Yeah.
If I have very high, I don't want it because I'm doing like 1 point here, 2 points there, 3 points instead of my normal 20, 25. So I think this passive's actually okay, but at the same time, I might consider just trying to spam more double lunge. You know,
Yeah,
instead of trying to ramp counter chance, I'd rather be just spamming double lunge.
yeah. I mean, if you're really into countering, this is definitely a passive to go with, but go for. But this is definitely one that you can skip on the skill tree, along with in the same regards of from the shadows or quick hands if you're not using the correct build.
Yeah, let me clarify that, by the way, because it kind of sounded like you couldn't use one with the other. You can use this with double lunge, and you would ramp up counter. But it's like you said, it might spark counter chains. If you don't want to spark counter chains, don't get so much counter chance. Just get your activated ability that you want to use really low cooldown, and that would be double lunge. So that's
Yeah.
what I meant.
So the final skill, Danse Macabre, probably saying that wrong.
Dance Macabre.
Okay. Critical strikes with daggers have 10% life drain, and the passive does add 5% to crit chance, which is really good. This one is definitely pretty good passive. I ended up putting my skill point into this, but I also thought it might have been good to spend that skill point elsewhere. What do you think, Darley?
Well, I love the crit chance on it, period. I think crits are just good to have. They benefit you as a whole. Here's the problem, right? Crit for daggers, from what I remember, because I was not able to look up the source of what I had seen before about what crits actually are doing in game right now. But for example, maces, when they crit, they do 100% daze chance. For daggers, it's plus 200% damage if they're unaware. So you're not getting any special benefit except for the normal crit damage bonuses you would get that are just regular bonus damage, right? You're not getting anything on top of that at the moment with daggers, just so you know. But there are so many good things to work off of crit and benefit crit in the dagger tree as a whole. The 10% life drain, in my opinion, could be bigger. I want it to be 15%. If it was 15%, I would have no problems putting the talent point in this period. But because, again, I've said over and over, dagger damage seems to be so low, I am worried that by the time I get to this point, I won't be dealing enough damage in order to make it worth it. Because I've gotten percent bonuses that are 10% or less, and it felt like it didn't have a substantial impact. It's a substantial enough impact to the damage that I was doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I definitely felt that way when I was using it. It sounded really good, and then once I was a few dungeons into using it, I really didn't notice the benefit that much. That's why I was saying, yeah, the +5 to crit chance is nice. It's going to be hard to get that elsewhere, but I don't know if that's enough. There are tons of other skills in combat mastery, athletics, and elsewhere, especially if you're using ranged weapons with Derwin, or even if you're being bold enough to use shields, where you might want to sink the point there as well. That's just how I felt after using it.
The thing about it is it specifically says critical strikes with daggers, not regular attacks. Only the critical strikes have the 10% life drain.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't have a high crit anyway, you might not get to use it. That's why it comes with that passive 5% crit. But crit also gets cut down, doesn't it, if you use dual wielding? So,
Yeah.
like, a lot of stuff gets cut down when you dual wield. So, I imagine a lot of people want to dual wield daggers. I could be wrong. But would be even harder to use with dual wielding. Is my point.
Yeah.
I just feel like this could be better. 15, 20% life drain on critical strikes. Yeah, something noticeable. But right as it now, I could pass on it if not for that plus 5% crit. The plus 5% crit is what it draws me to this talent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty much the only thing to me.
Yeah, I think I can't speak for everybody, but when I see daggers, I can't imagine not having them in both hands. And especially when you look at your first move, double lunge. Yeah, I know it implies that you're stabbing them twice with one weapon, but it also says, hey, you should probably be dual wielding daggers. That's probably the most fun. I definitely had a lot of fun doing it, even though that was before dual wielding was even a thing. So.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so that we're kind of to the conclusion of looking at swords versus daggers. I guess the final verdict, DarLeeLlama, what's your favorite between the two? Would you pick swords or daggers?
Um, I'm not in the same position as you in that I think daggers need to be dual wielded. Having a single dagger and using double lunge with 2 attacks attached to one ability would be more than enough for me. I could actually see using dagger with shield, no problem. Kind of, if you think about it, as long as you use like the little bucklers, it's kind of like your duelist, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But here's how I feel. I feel like there are more bleed abilities, noticeable bleed abilities attached to sword, but daggers seem to overall do bleed more efficiently, if that makes sense. They have gaping wound. They've got double lunge, and then coup de grace, which all feeds off of that, and it sets it up to be really powerful bleed chances. Their bleed chances seem to be higher than swords. But swords also has a lot of utility. If you're wanting utility, you go swords because it's got the gap closer, it's got the dodge back skill, it's got the bonuses to having your, or it's got good passive stuff, particularly for wearing them down. I feel like if you want to bleed them instantly, daggers. If you want to bleed them over time, swords with utility. I actually think swords wins out overall than daggers just because of that utility and because there are less points you have to spend. We are comparing a 10-point tree to an 8-point tree. So that is something to keep in mind. It's easier to get the stuff you want from swords than it is to get the stuff you want from daggers necessarily.
Yeah,
So I'm going with swords on this. I like daggers. I especially like that coup de grace, which is super powerful. But swords for me.
No, I see your point of view, definitely. Especially when you look at the sword skill tree and you can get to the bottom within 3 points as long as you have all the necessary treaties. But when I'm playing games, I don't always go for logical, calculated, I guess, approach in trying to figure out max damage and all those kinds of things. I think aesthetics always plays a lot into it for me, as long as it makes sense. So I definitely going to go with daggers. Even though it's 10 points, there are a number of skills that you can completely skip in this tree and still get to the good stuff. Not nearly as quickly as swords, but with nearly the same. So I would still pick daggers. I think I will play daggers again just because of how much I enjoyed it. So that's kind of my verdict on it.
Fair enough.
Yeah, so this concludes the first episode of BeardoDood and DarLeeLlama discussing the different skill trees within Stoneshard. We are going to do more of these. We're going to look at other stuff. We'll probably compare great swords and spears, axes, maces, ranged weapons, looking crossbows and bows themselves, and probably even dig into the utility tree, and of course Pyromancy versus Geomancy, which will probably be the most difficult discussion because they're both awesome. So that's all for today. I'd like to thank my guest DarLeeLlama for joining me in this discussion. Do you have anything to tell the people?
Sure. I hope they had fun watching us as we did talking for them. Don't forget to check out my vids over on my channel. I usually update 12 and 6. Be sure to leave a comment if you have something to say, and take care, stay safe, have a wonderful day.
Yeah, definitely leave a comment if you want to argue with us and tell us that we're completely wrong on everything we've said. But yeah, thanks for watching.
Watch out, we'll argue back too.
Yeah, exactly. We might be coming back at you. So thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Check out DarLeeLlama's channel. It'll be linked in the description. Hit that bell notification, and we'll see you on the next one, guys. Peace.
Take care.